I still remember the smell of counterseptic gel on my hands, the way it never quite washed away, no matter how many times I scrubbed beneath the scalding water in my hab unit. That was before I understood that the smell wasn't clinging to my skin at all, but had worked its way into my sinuses, my lungs, the very tissues of my body, until I couldn't tell where the biologist processing facility ended and I began. They tell me I've been reassigned now. They tell me my service continues in a different capacity. The words mean something, I'm sure, though their significance escapes me as I record this testimony into the data slate they've provided. My fingers remember the motion of typing even if I can't quite recall why it matters. There's a sound in my head, a whirring that might be machinery or might be memory, and I find myself unable to distinguish between the two. I came to Forge World Metallica as an administrative functionary, 3rd class, assigned to the Department of Biologist Resource Acquisition and Distribution. The title was longer than my training period, 6 weeks of memorizing forms, processing codes, and Imperial compliance regulations. Then they handed me a crimson robe that smelled of machine oil and said I would learn the rest through practical application. The facility squatted on the edge of the Forge City like a tumor of rust-red metal and ceramite, its walls 30 meters thick, to contain what the orientation holovid carefully referred to as sensitive biological processing procedures. I didn't ask what that meant. You learned quickly on Metallica that questions were inefficiencies, and inefficiencies were sins against the Omnissiah. My supervisor was an engineer named Logis Adept Threnix, more machine than man, his remaining organic face a slice of grey skin stretched over titanium skull plates. When he spoke, his vox grill clicked, and word in a rhythm I would come to know as well as my own heartbeat. He showed me to my station on my first day, a cogitator terminal in a windowless office carved from the facility's inner structure, surrounded by filing servitors whose vacant eyes tracked my movements with the disinterest of damaged picked recorders. Your function, Threnix explained, his biological eye focusing on me while his mechanical one swiveled independently to scan a data slate, is to process acquisition protocols. You will receive subject manifests from the arbitrators, the ecclesiarchy, and occasionally the administratum itself. You will verify their documentation, confirm their physiological suitability, and authorize their transfer to the processing floors below. This is sacred work. The Omnissiah requires raw materials for the construction of his holy servitors, and you facilitate his divine will. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The office was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, as if the very air had been drained of something essential. Threnix's remaining organic eye studied me with what might have been amusement or might have been the muscular tick of someone who'd forgotten how expressions worked. You will receive your first manifest within the hour, he said, and the whirring of his augmetic components accompanied him as he departed, leaving me alone with the servitors and the hum of the cogitator, and a question I didn't yet know how to ask. What exactly was I acquiring? The first manifest arrived as promised, scrolling across my screen in high Gothic script, interspersed with Mechanicus cant, 23 subjects, all convicted of crimes against the Imperium, theft of ration tickets, unlicensed reproduction, failure to meet production quotas, speaking words of doubt about the Emperor's providence. The charges were mundane, the kind of petty transgressions that could doom anyone in the lower hives. Next to each name was a physiological assessment, skull measurements, neural activity scans, genetic markers, probability of successful extraction. I didn't understand half the terminology, but the cogitator helpfully highlighted the ones that met requirements in sickly green, 17 of the 23. I approved them with a keystroke, and something in the facility's depths responded with a sound like a great mechanical breath being drawn. They arrived 3 days later. I watched from the observation gallery above the receiving bay as the arbitrator's transport disgorged them in chains, men and women whose faces carried the particular hollowness of those who'd been told their lives were ending, but hadn't yet processed what form that ending would take. They stood in their prison greys, while Mechanicus menials scanned their identification tattoos, checking them against my approved manifest. One woman kept looking around as if searching for someone who might explain the mistake, who might tell her this wasn't real. I wanted to look away, but Threnix had appeared beside me, his mechanical hand resting on the gallery railing, and I understood this was part of my education. "Watch," he said, and his vox grill gave the word the quality of a prayer. "This is where meat becomes purpose." The subjects were divided into groups based on the color-coded markers the cogitator had assigned: green for immediate processing, yellow for quarantine and medical adjustment, red for special requirements. The woman who'd been searching for salvation was marked green. She went quietly, following the servitors that herded her group toward the processing floors, and I heard her speaking softly to herself prayers to the Emperor, I thought, or perhaps just counting her breaths to prove she was still alive. The sound of the maglocks engaging behind them had a finality that made my hands shake, though I couldn't have said why. It was all proper procedure. Everything had been authorized. The forms were complete. I learned the rhythm of the work quickly. Manifests arrived. I processed them. Subjects were delivered. Sometimes they came from prisons, sometimes from ecclesiarchy penal shrines, sometimes from the manufactorums where workers who'd failed efficiency standards were remanded to productive repurposing. The facility processed approximately 200 subjects per week, though the number fluctuated based on factors I wasn't privy to: military campaigns requiring servitor reinforcements, construction projects demanding specialized units, losses in the Forge City's own servitor population due to wear or malfunction. My role was to ensure the supply remained constant, that the raw materials flowed without interruption. I was, Threnix explained during one of his periodic reviews, a vital component in a sacred machine. After my first month, they granted me expanded access. I could leave my office, move through the upper levels of the facility, observe the intake procedures more closely. I told myself this was a sign of trust, proof that I'd mastered my duties. The truth, which I wouldn't recognize until much later, was that they were acclimating me, degree by degree, to what happened in the depths below my feet. The observation galleries became familiar territory. I watched subjects arrive, watched them sorted and tagged and led away, watched the servitors that moved among them with the efficiency of stockyard machines. There was a sound that pervaded everything, a mechanical whirring that came from the ventilation systems or the processing floors or somewhere in the facility's hidden infrastructure. It was constant, rhythmic, almost soothing in its predictability. I began to associate it with productivity, with things working as intended. It was in my second month that I encountered Subject 77 Kappa 19. His manifest listed him as Gregor Valence, convicted of speaking against the Adeptus Mechanicus's methods during a labor dispute in the lower manufactorums. Age 34. Neurologically optimal. No genetic defects. Probability of successful extraction, 97%. He should have been unremarkable. Just another entry in the endless stream of subjects, but something about his intake interview stayed with me. I'd begun reviewing the interview recordings not because it was required, but because the silence of my HAB unit had become oppressive, and the recordings filled it with voices that weren't my own thoughts. Valence spoke calmly to the intake servitor, answering its questions without the hysteria or denial that characterized most subjects. When asked if he understood his sentence, he said yes. When asked if he had final testimony to record, he said only, "I want someone to know that I was a person who loved his work. I was good at what I did. That should matter. It shouldn't have affected me." It was sentiment, inefficiency, the kind of organic attachment the Mechanicus rightfully purged in favor of pure function. But I found myself reviewing his file repeatedly, checking his progression through the preliminary stages. He was scheduled for conversion in 72 hours standard processing time for optimal subjects. The cogitator had already assigned him a servitor designation, loader class, Mark 7, intended for cargo operations in the Forge City's transit stations. His brain would be carefully excised, pruned of unnecessary functions, reprogrammed with the machine cant that would govern his new existence. His body would be augmented with lifting servos and load-bearing enhancements. He would serve the Omnissiah's will with perfect efficiency, freed from the burden of doubt or desire or the memory of loving his work. I attended his processing. This wasn't part of my duties, but no one questioned my presence in the observation gallery above Processing Theatre 7. Perhaps they thought I was developing the proper detachment, learning to see subjects not as people but as components awaiting assembly. Valence was brought in, sedated but conscious. The procedure required a certain level of neural activity for optimal extraction. He was secured to the surgical frame, his head locked in position by restraints that had worn grooves in the metal from countless previous subjects. The tech priests who would perform the conversion moved around him with ritual precision, anointing their tools with sacred oils, chanting the litany of disassembly. The lead surgeon was a Magos Biologis, whose name I never learned. His body, a baroque construction of surgical mechadendrites and augmetic limbs. He approached Valence with something like reverence, or perhaps I was projecting. Perhaps it was simply the careful attention of a craftsman approaching familiar work. The first incision was made with a laser scalpel that parted skin and muscle with no blood. The flesh sealed instantly by cauterizing heat. I could smell it from the gallery: burning protein, counterseptic vapor, the sharp ozone tang of active power fields. Valence's eyes were open, tracking the ceiling above him, and I wondered what he saw in those final moments before they reached his brain. The Emperor's light, the Omnissiah's wisdom, or just the dirty grey ceiling of a processing theatre where countless others had undergone the same transformation? The whirring sound intensified as they activated the cranial saw. It was a precise instrument, cutting through bone in a perfect circle, preserving the integrity of the skull for later sealing. The removed section was placed in a sterile tray by an attendant servitor itself, probably created in this same theatre, its own human origin lost in the mechanical efficiency of its movements. What lay beneath was grey and pink and glistening, webbed with blood vessels that pulsed with Valence's heartbeat. The Magos Biologis extended his mechadendrites, their tips bristling with microblades and neural probes, and began the delicate work of separation. I should have looked away. I should have returned to my office, to the clean abstraction of manifests and authorization codes, but I watched, transfixed, as they peeled back the layers of what made Gregor Valence himself. The cerebral cortex came first, the seat of higher reasoning and personality, carefully sectioned and examined for defects before being placed in preservation fluid. The limbic system followed, emotions and memory chemically locked in amber for potential later analysis. The brain stem they left intact. It would control the servitor's basic functions, breathing and circulation, and the autonomic processes that kept meat alive. Everything else, all the inefficient human complexity, was harvested with the thoroughness of miners extracting ore from worthless stone. What remained was a biological engine waiting to be programmed. The tech priests lowered the control matrix, a crown of cables and neural interfaces that would replace Valence's severed connections with new ones, digital pathways that responded only to command codes and binary imperatives. I saw his eyes move one final time as the matrix made contact, a last flutter of organic response before the machine cant began its work, overwriting whatever remnant of Gregor Valence might have survived the extraction. Then stillness, then the whirring sound of successful integration, confirmation chimes from the Magos Biologis's instruments, the satisfied clicking of Threnix's Vox grill as he made notes on his data slate beside me. Textbook conversion, Threnix observed. 97% probability of successful extraction, and here we achieve 99% integration. The Omnissiah's grace is evident in such precision. He turned to me, both eyes organic and mechanical, fixing on my face. You are developing the proper perspective, I think. You watch the entire procedure without distress. This is good. Emotional responses are inefficiencies we must purge, just as we purge unnecessary neural tissue from our subjects. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That should have concerned me, but instead, I felt a strange calm, as if something in my own neural architecture had been subtly adjusted during the hours I'd spent watching Valence's transformation. The whirring sound had become almost musical, a hymn to efficiency and purpose. When I returned to my office, I approved the next manifest without hesitation, my fingers moving across the cogitator keys with newfound confidence. 29 subjects, all marked green for immediate processing. The facility breathed its mechanical breath, and somewhere in its depths, the conversion theaters prepared to receive them. My efficiency ratings improved. Threnix commended me during my quarterly review, noting that my processing speed had increased 47%, while my error rate had dropped to nearly zero. I was granted further access privileges now. I could visit the holding cells where subjects awaited processing, observe their medical preparations, even attend the preliminary neural mappings that helped the tech priests plan their extraction strategies. I told myself this was career advancement, that I was becoming a valued member of the facility's operations. But late at night, in my hab unit, I would lie awake, listening to the ventilation systems whir and wonder when I'd stopped thinking of them as people and started categorizing them by skull measurements and extraction probabilities. The holding cells occupied level -3, a warren of reinforced compartments arranged around a central monitoring station. Each cell held between 5 and 10 subjects depending on their processing schedule, sorted by the color codes I'd assigned. I began conducting personal inspections, telling myself it was quality assurance, making sure the subjects matched their manifests. The truth was more complex. I was searching for something, though I couldn't name what. Perhaps some sign that what we were doing was necessary, that these people truly deserved the transformation awaiting them, that their crimes justified the complete erasure of everything they'd been. What I found instead was banal human suffering. The subjects weren't monsters or heretics or traitors to the Imperium. They were workers who'd stolen extra rations to feed their children, believers who'd questioned a priest's interpretation of doctrine, administrators who'd made arithmetic errors in their tithes. They were the inefficient, the unlucky, the ones who'd stumbled in a system that demanded perfection and punished anything less with absolute finality. They sat in their cells, speaking in hushed voices or not speaking at all, their faces carrying the numb exhaustion of people who'd given up fighting the inevitable. Sometimes they asked me questions. When would the processing happen? Would it hurt? Could they send messages to their families? I learned to walk past without responding. Engagement was inefficiency. But one subject broke through my developing detachment. Her manifest identified her as Kara Methrin, age 19, convicted of unlicensed artistic expression. She'd painted murals in the lower hive levels, without ecclesiarchy approval, images of the emperor that apparently deviated from approved iconography. Her probability of successful extraction was listed at 94%. Excellent numbers. She was marked green, scheduled for conversion into a scribe-class servitor within 48 hours. When I conducted my inspection of her holding cell, she was sitting apart from the others, her hands moving in small repetitive gestures. I realized she was painting, her fingers tracing shapes in the air, recreating the act even though she had no materials, no surface, no possibility of creation. "What are you making?" I asked, the words escaping before I could suppress them. The other subjects in the cell looked at me with surprise. Apparently they'd grown accustomed to being ignored by the facility's functionaries. Kara's hands stilled, and she met my eyes with a directness that should have been impossible for someone awaiting conversion. "The Emperor, as I see him," she said quietly. "Not the way the priests taught me, but the way he appears in my dreams, as a man who's tired beyond measure, but keeps walking anyway because stopping would mean failing everyone who needs him. I've been painting the same image since they arrested me. I'll probably paint it in my mind until whatever happens next." I should have reprimanded her for speaking without permission. I should have logged her response as evidence of continued ideological deviation. Instead, I found myself asking, why paint him that way? The approved iconography shows him victorious, eternal, beyond human weakness. She smiled, and it was the saddest expression I'd ever seen. "Because I think He'd rather we see him as someone who understands how hard it is to keep going, someone who knows what it costs. Her hands resumed their invisible painting. They're going to take this away from me, aren't they? The ability to see things this way, to imagine, to make something that wasn't there before. Yes, I said, because lying would have been a different kind of cruelty. The conversion process removes unnecessary neural complexity. You'll serve in a different capacity, more efficiently. Will I know what I've lost? She asked. Or will the person who knew how to paint just stop existing, and something else will wear my body without ever realizing it's not me anymore? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I left the holding cells and returned to my office, but her words followed me like the facility's omnipresent whirring. That night I accessed her full file, reading beyond the basic manifest data. She'd been painting since childhood, covering every surface in her family's HAB unit with colors scavenged from industrial waste and pigments made from crushed minerals. Her work had brought beauty to one of the hive's bleakest sectors, giving people something to look at besides rust and decay. The ecclesiarchy had declared it unsanctioned worship, arrested her during a sweep for ideological deviance, and sentenced her to productive repurposing. In 48 hours, her hands would hold data styluses instead of brushes, transcribing reports she'd never read about subjects she'd never comprehend, and the part of her that asked difficult questions about the Emperor's fatigue would be medical waste awaiting incineration. I attended her conversion. I told myself it was professional development, learning the full scope of our operations. The truth was, I needed to witness what my manifests enabled, to see the direct result of my approved keystrokes. Kara was brought to processing theater, 4 already sedated, though her eyes tracked the room's movements with desperate clarity. They kept subjects conscious through the initial stages, something about neural mapping requiring active brain function. The tech priests worked with their usual ritual precision, but I found myself watching her hands, the way her fingers twitched even restrained to the surgical frame, still trying to paint. The Magos Biologis, performing her conversion, was more efficient than the one who'd processed Valence. The cranial saw word through bone in less than 3 minutes, and the mechadendrites descended with practiced grace, separating the tissues that made Kara Methrin an artist from the meat that would host her Servitor programming. I watched them extract her visual cortex, the section of her brain that had translated the world into images worth preserving. It went into a specimen jar, grey matter floating in suspension, and I thought about all the paintings that would never exist now, all the Emperor's faces she'd never capture, in colors made from hope and stolen pigments. The extraction of her frontal lobe took longer. This was where personality resided, where the questions about the Emperor's burden had originated. The Magos Biologis dissected it with clinical thoroughness, his mechadendrites separating hemispheres and excavating the neural pathways that had made her dangerous to the ecclesiarchy's authority. What remained was the autonomic core, the brainstem and basic processing centers that would keep her body functioning, while the control matrix provided its new programming. Scribe-class servitors needed minimal cognitive function, just enough to hold a stylus, recognize data patterns, and transcribe information with mechanical accuracy. All the inefficient complexity of imagination and doubt was waste material, already being catalogued for the facility's research archive. When the control matrix lowered onto what remained of Kara's brain, her hands made one final gesture, fingers splayed in a pattern I recognized from her invisible painting. Then the machine cant began its work, binary imperatives overwriting organic chaos, and her hands went still, except for the programmed micro-tremors that would let her hold a stylus steady for 18-hour transcription shifts. The whirring of successful integration filled processing theater 4, and the Magos Biologis made a notation of satisfaction in his logs. Another textbook conversion, another servitor ready for deployment, another person erased with bureaucratic efficiency. I threw up in the observation gallery's waste receptacle, my body rebelling even as my mind tried to process what I'd witnessed. Threnix found me there, hunched over the receptacle, my crimson robes damp with sweat that smelled of counterseptic and fear. His mechanical eye whirred as it focused on me, analyzing my distress with the same clinical precision the Magos Biologis had applied to Kara's brain. "Interesting," Threnix said, his vox grill clicking with what might have been concern or might have been mere observation. "You're developing an inefficiency. Your neural chemistry is producing excessive emotional responses to standard procedures. This is problematic." He consulted his data slate. Mechadendrites, scrolling through information I couldn't see. "We should have anticipated this. Organic minds exposed to our work sometimes develop maladaptive patterns. The remedy is straightforward." "What remedy?" I asked, though part of me already had understood from the moment Threnix's tone shifted from supervisor to diagnostician. "Chemical adjustment," he said. "Mild sedatives to regulate your emotional responses, neurological dampeners to reduce excessive empathic activation. Nothing severe, we need you functional, not converted. Your administrative skills are valuable, we simply need to optimize your neural efficiency." He extended a mechadendrite holding a small injector. "This is standard procedure for functionaries showing signs of ideological drift. You're not the first to require adjustment, and you won't be the last. The Omnissiah understands that flesh is weak, but also that it can be corrected." I took the injector. What choice did I have? Refusal would be logged as evidence of further deviation, proof that my efficiency decline had progressed beyond chemical correction. I'd seen the files on functionaries who refused treatment. They were reclassified as subjects, sent through the same manifests they'd once processed, converted into the servitors they'd authorized. The irony was considered educationally valuable. I pressed the injector against my neck and felt the cold rush of pharmaceuticals entering my bloodstream, carrying their promise of optimization and relief from the burden of caring too much. The effects were immediate and profound. The churning nausea subsided, replaced by a gentle numbness that wrapped my thoughts in soft insulation. I could still observe the facility's operations, still process manifests and authorize conversions, but the emotional impact had been muffled, as if I was experiencing everything through a protective barrier. I attended processing procedures without physical distress. I inspected holding cells without hearing the subject's questions. I approved manifests with steady hands that never shook, never hesitated, never paused over names that might have been people I'd known in another context. My efficiency ratings climbed even higher. Threnix praised my recovery, noting in my review that I'd overcome my temporary malfunction and emerged as a model functionary. I was granted access to level -5, where the harvested neural tissue was stored and studied, where the Magos Biologis maintained their research into brain function and servitor optimization. I walked among tanks of preserved brains, each labeled with subject numbers and extraction dates, and felt nothing but professional curiosity about their organization and storage protocols. The whirring sound that pervaded the facility had become so familiar, I only noticed it when it stopped, when maintenance cycles brought brief moments of silence that felt wrong, incomplete, like missing a heartbeat. It was during one of these maintenance cycles that I discovered the truth about Subject 77 Kappa 19. I was reviewing archived manifests busywork to fill the unsettling silence when I noticed an anomaly in Gregor Valence's file. His post-conversion monitoring showed unusual neural activity, patterns that suggested retained cognitive function beyond standard servitor parameters. The Magos Biologis had flagged it for study but not for correction, curious about whether partial personality retention might enhance certain servitor classes. I accessed the monitoring footage from his current deployment. Valence, or what had been Valence, was working in one of the Forge City's transit stations, loading cargo containers onto rail cars with the mechanical precision of his new existence. But between tasks, during the microseconds of processing lag that even optimized servitors experienced, I saw something in his remaining eye that looked almost like recognition. He would pause, servo-enhanced arms frozen mid-lift, and his eye would track the workers moving around him with an expression that might have been longing or might have been the muscular ghost of emotions his brain could no longer process. The monitoring AI had flagged these pauses as potential malfunctions, recommended he be recalled for adjustment, but the tech priests had decided to observe rather than intervene, fascinated by the question of what remained when you removed everything that made someone human except the core that kept them breathing. I should have approved the recall order. Inefficient servitors were safety hazards and productivity drains, but something in those pauses stopped me. Something in the ghost of Gregor Valance still trying to love his work even after they'd excised the capacity for love from his brain. I denied the recall, logging it as administrative oversight, telling myself the pharmaceutical optimization had dulled my judgment. The truth was that I needed him to keep existing, even in his broken partial state, because it meant that some trace of the people I'd processed might survive their conversions, might persist in ways the tech priests hadn't anticipated. This was, of course, an inefficiency. Threnix noticed within a week. He appeared in my office accompanied by 2 Skitarii guards, their augmetic enhancements humming with barely restrained violence. His mechanical eye focused on me while his organic eye reviewed a data slate that I somehow knew contained my recent decisions, my denied recall orders, my growing pattern of choices that prioritized subjects over efficiency. "You've developed a malfunction," Threnix said, and his vox grill made it sound like a diagnosis of terminal disease. "The chemical optimization should have corrected your inefficiency, but your behavior suggests deeper neural pathology. You're anthropomorphizing the subjects, attributing continued personhood to converted servitors, making decisions based on sentiment rather than operational requirements. This is not acceptable." "I'm still processing manifests within standard timeframes," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "My efficiency ratings are irrelevant when weighed against ideological deviation." Threnix made a gesture, and the Skitarii moved closer, their presence a promise of violence if I resisted. "You've been showing signs of what the magos biologists call empathic contagion. Prolonged exposure to subjects awaiting conversion has activated portions of your neural architecture that interfere with optimal phased function. Your brain has been forming attachments, constructing narratives of personhood around data points, experiencing distress at procedures you should recognize as sacred work." He paused, and I thought I saw something like regret in his organic eye, though it might have been a trick of the harsh lumens. "We could attempt more aggressive chemical correction, but your case has progressed beyond pharmaceutical intervention. The only reliable solution is direct neural optimization." I understood what he was offering. Conversion, the same process I'd authorized for thousands of subjects, now waiting for me, my own manifest, already approved by some functionary upstream who'd seen my declining efficiency and made the same cold calculation I'd made countless times. I would be strapped to a surgical frame, my skull opened, my brain carefully dissected to remove the parts that had started caring too much. What remained would serve the Omnissiah with perfect loyalty, freed from the burden of remembering that Subject 77 Kappa 19 had been Gregor Valance, that the scribe-class servitor in Archive Section 7 had once painted the Emperor's face with stolen pigments, that all the numbers in my manifests had been people who'd loved and feared and hoped before I'd reduced them to extraction probabilities. "There is an alternative," Threnix continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been negotiation if machines negotiated instead of simply calculating optimal outcomes. "Your administrative skills are genuinely valuable. Your neural pathology, while problematic, also gives you insight into subject psychology that our more optimized functionaries lack. If you're willing to undergo a different kind of service, we can preserve your cognitive function while still addressing your inefficiency." "What kind of service?" I asked, though the whirring sound in my head, the facility's mechanical breath, or my own deteriorating sanity already whispered the answer. "Acquisition specialist," Threnix said. "Currently, we rely on arbitrators and ecclesiarchy officials to supply our subject manifests, but they lack understanding of our specific requirements. They send us criminals and deviants without proper neural screening, resulting in waste and inefficiency. We need someone who understands both the human population and our servitor optimization, needs someone who can go into the hives and manufactorums and identify ideal candidates before they're processed through the legal system. Someone who can recognize the perfect brain for harvesting and arrange the circumstances that will bring it to our facility. He was offering me a promotion, a chance to continue existing as something resembling human, to avoid the surgical frame and the whirring cranial saw and the mechadendrites that separated self from meat. All I had to do was become a hunter, stalking the population of the Forge City for brains that matched our specifications, manufacturing crimes or emergencies or circumstances that would justify their acquisition, feeding the facility's endless hunger with conscious intention instead of administrative detachment. I would be complicit in a more direct way, personally responsible for each subject I identified and procured, but I would remain myself, would keep the neural complexity that let me care, even though caring was inefficiency. And if I refuse? I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Then you'll receive a manifest authorization with your own identification number, Threnix said. Processing Theater 7 is scheduled for a maintenance cycle tomorrow. They could fit in one additional conversion beforehand. We'd even let you choose your servitor classification, a professional courtesy to recognize your prior service. What will it be? Acquisition Specialist? Or Subject 77 Kappa? He consulted his data slate. 923? The whirring sound intensified, or maybe my perception of it sharpened, and I heard within it the breathing of thousands of servitors throughout the Forge City, all of them once people whose brains I'd approved for harvesting, all of them still technically alive in the way that meat could be alive, while everything that made it human had been carefully excised and stored in specimen jars. I thought of Gregor Valance in his transit station, his remaining eye-tracking workers with the ghost of the love he'd once felt for his work. I thought of Cara Methrin transcribing reports she couldn't read, her hands that had painted the Emperor now holding data styluses with programmed precision. I thought of all the others, thousands upon thousands, their brains floating in preservation fluid, while their bodies served the Omnissiah's will with perfect efficiency. I thought of them, and I accepted the alternative. Now I walk the lower hives with my data slate and my authorization codes and my understanding of exactly what constitutes an optimal brain for harvesting. I've become skilled at my work. Threnix commends me regularly for my procurement efficiency. I can identify neural quality with remarkable accuracy, can look at a worker or administrator or believer and calculate their extraction probability within a margin of error small enough to impress the Magos Biologis. I've learned which crimes can be manufactured to justify acquisition, which authorities can be persuaded to overlook procedural irregularities, which families can be convinced their loved ones died serving the Emperor rather than being converted into servitors that load cargo or transcribe reports or perform any of the 1,000 menial tasks that keep the Imperium functioning. I'm good at what I do. That should matter, just as Gregor Valance's skill at his work should have mattered before I approved his conversion. But I know now that competence is no protection against the Omnissiah's hunger for brains, that loving your work doesn't save you from becoming the work itself, that the facility's whirring breath will continue long after I'm gone, processing new subjects identified by whoever replaces me when my own neural efficiency begins to decline, because it will decline. I've seen it happen to other acquisition specialists. The pharmaceutical optimization that lets us function eventually damages our neural tissue, creating the same pathologies we're meant to procure in others. We become our own best candidates for conversion, our brains worn perfect by the work of finding perfect brains, and the cycle continues with machine-like inevitability. I've already noticed the signs in myself, moments of dissociation, difficulty distinguishing between subjects and people, the sense that the whirring sound has worked its way inside my skull and is now an integral part of my thoughts rather than an external phenomenon. They tell me I've been reassigned now. They tell me my service continues in a different capacity. The magos biologists who examined me said I've provided excellent research data on the progression of empathic contagion in acquisition specialists, that my neural deterioration followed predicted patterns with exemplary consistency, that my brain will make an ideal specimen for their ongoing studies of how organic minds cope with prolonged exposure to servitor creation processes. He seemed pleased, in the limited way that beings more machine than man can express satisfaction, as he explained that they'd learned a great deal from my service and would learn even more from my conversion. I'm sitting in a holding cell now, marked green for immediate processing, and I understand finally what all those subjects felt in their final hours. The other occupants of the cell don't speak, they're lost in their own preparations for the inevitable, but I find myself wanting to tell them that I understand, that I was once on the other side of the observation gallery, that I approved manifests and attended conversions and thought myself distinct from the numbers I processed, until I learned that everyone in the Omnissiah's service is eventually reduced to extraction probabilities and harvested neural tissue. There's a sound in my head, a whirring that might be machinery, or might be memory, or might be the last parts of myself trying to hold together before they're separated by mechadendrites and stored in specimen jars. I wonder what Servitor classification they'll assign me. Whether some future acquisition specialist will see my partial personality retained in monitoring footage, will notice the ghost of recognition in my remaining eye, will deny the recall order out of sentiment and inefficiency, whether anything of me will survive the conversion, or whether the person writing this testimony will simply stop existing and something else will wear my body without ever realizing it's not me anymore. The maglocks are cycling. They're coming to collect us. My manifest has been approved. I saw it myself before they revoked my terminal access. Saw my own name in the list of subjects awaiting processing. Saw the extraction probability listed at 98%. Excellent numbers. The tech priests will be pleased. I imagine I can already hear the cranial saws whir, can feel the cold of the surgical frame against my back, can sense the mechadendrites descending to separate the parts of me that cared too much from the meat that will continue serving long after I've forgotten why it mattered. The Emperor protects, they say. But he doesn't protect everyone equally, and he certainly doesn't protect those whose brains are optimized for harvesting. I think of Kara Methrin's final question, will I know what I've lost? And I realize the cruelty isn't in the conversion itself, but in the moment before. In this last clarity where I understand exactly what's about to be taken and can do nothing to prevent it. The whirring grows louder. The footsteps approach. The door opens. And the servitors that will herd me to processing theater 7 wear faces I might have once known, might have once approved for conversion, might have once reduced to manifest numbers with efficient keystrokes. I rise from the cell's bench because resistance is inefficiency, and I learned long ago that the Omnissiah's work continues regardless of individual preference or fear, or the desperate hope that somewhere in the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, someone might notice a mistake and issue a recall order that saves me from the fate I've imposed on thousands. But there are no mistakes in the sacred work of brain harvesting, no inefficiencies in the endless cycle of acquisition and conversion and deployment. There is only the whirring sound of the facility's mechanical breath, and the knowledge that my service continues, will always continue, in whatever form the Omnissiah requires. They're placing the restraints now. The surgical frame is cold, exactly as I knew it would be. Above me, in the observation gallery, a new functionary watches with the professional detachment I once cultivated, making notes on a data slate about my neural responses to impending conversion. I want to tell them to look away, to refuse the pharmaceutical optimization, to quit before they become complicit in the machinery that's about to reduce me to extracted neural tissue and reprogrammed meat. But the sedatives are already in my bloodstream, and my voice, when I try to speak, produces only the clicking sounds that presage the loss of human language. The magos biologist enters, his mechadendrites unfolding like the petals of some mechanical flower, and I see in his augmetic eyes the same clinical interest he showed in every other subject I approved for his attention. He speaks the litany of disassembly, anointing his instruments with sacred oils, and the whirring intensifies until I can't tell where the facility ends and my consciousness begins. The cranial saw descends. The last thing I think, before the first incision, is that somewhere in the Forge City, Gregor Valence is loading cargo with servo-enhanced arms, and perhaps in the microseconds between tasks, his remaining eye still searches for something he can't name, some ghost of the person he was before I decided his brain met requirements and approved his manifest with a keystroke. Perhaps he'll continue searching long after I'm converted, long after whatever remains of me begins its own servitor work, long after the new acquisition specialist processes their first manifest and takes another step toward this same inevitable frame. Perhaps, in the end, that searching is all that's left of any of us, the ghost of ourselves still trying to paint, still trying to love our work, still trying to matter even after everything that made us matter has been harvested for the Omnissiah's glory. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's the only mercy the Imperium offers. Not salvation, not escape, but the possibility that some fragment might persist, some inefficient scrap of who we were continuing to function in the margins of our reprogrammed existence. The saw begins its work. The whirring becomes everything. And I discover, in these final moments of being myself, that Kara Methrin was right to ask her question, because I will know what I've lost, will carry that knowledge for the fraction of a second before the mechadendrites sever the neural pathways that make knowing possible. And in that instant, I will understand every subject I ever processed, every manifest I approved, every brain I identified for harvesting, and I will know that they all had this same moment of perfect, terrible clarity before they ceased being people and became purpose. The Emperor protects, the Omnissiah provides, the machine endures, and somewhere in the facility's depths, in tanks of preservation fluid, thousands of harvested brains float in eternal silence, still technically alive, still serving in their way, all of them once believing they mattered until the moment they discovered how efficiently mattering could be extracted and repurposed for the glory of the Imperium. The whirring sound is everything now. My final thought, before I stop having thoughts in any recognizable sense, is that I was a person who loved his work, who was good at what he did, and that should have mattered but doesn't, has never mattered, will never matter in a galaxy that measures worth in extraction probabilities and processing efficiency, and the endless industrial conversion of humans into the machinery that sustains human civilization. Then the mechadendrites descend, and I am harvested.